Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here for our special edition webcast, What Animal Shelters Need to Know About the Canine Influenza Outbreak. I'm Lynn Fridley, Program Manager for Maddie's Institute. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Sandra Newberry, Director of the University of Wisconsin Shelter Medicine Program in Madison, Wisconsin, and Assistant Professor of Shelter Medicine in the School of Veterinary Medicine, Department of Medical Sciences. Dr. Newberry has worked closely with the shelters in the Chicago area to help address the canine influenza outbreak. Before we start, let's talk about a few housekeeping items. Please take a look at the left side of your screen where you'll see a Q&A window. That's where you'll ask questions during the presentation. The presentation will be short, allowing more time for questions, but don't hold them till the end. Questions asked in the last few minutes will probably not be processed in time for a response. If you need help with your connection during the presentation, you can click the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. The green File widget contains the presentation handout and a printable certificate of attendance for people attending this live event. So be sure to download, save, and print. Dr. Newberry, thanks for being here with us this evening.
Thank you so much, Lynn. It's really great to be here, and I'm so grateful to Maddie's for giving me the opportunity to be able to share all this information that we've learned working with the shelters in Chicago during this outbreak. And we've got a lot to talk about, but as Lynn said, I think we'll have lots of time for questions, so please make sure you're putting your questions in as you go through. And some of this, just so everyone is really aware, is this is really not finished. This outbreak is still ongoing. Just yesterday we had one more shelter that became affected that had been previously negative, and so a lot of the information that you're getting is even information that's new just from yesterday. And poor Lynn had to change some slides for me, so we've got a lot of information going forward, and I hope you'll know that some of it is actually very new, and we'll go from there. So if you have questions, let us know. This little girl right here, we'll talk about her again. She couldn't be cuter. She was the index case, we think, for Chicago Animal Care and Control, and we'll come back around and talk about her a little bit more. So she's our poster child for today, and the good news is she's all recovered, ready to go. I wanted to thank the Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Lab, especially Dr. Kurth and Dr. Paulson, for going really above and beyond with diagnostic testing for these shelters. Maddie Fund, who responded incredibly quickly to my pleas for help as we realized that shelters really needed to have more information in order to be able to manage this all effectively. And so the WVDL and Maddie's Fund and our shelter medicine program have all been working as closely as we can, going down to Chicago quite often to work with the shelters and the rescues down there. And I'll say this again a little later in the presentation, but I couldn't be prouder or more in admiration of the shelters in Chicago for the work that they're doing and the way that they're managing this really difficult situation for them. I also wanted to thank Merck and IDEXX and Cornell for sharing information to help everyone manage the outbreak. They shared a lot of information with me, and I'll let you know as I'm showing you the information that they've shared with me so that I can, in turn, share it with you. So this has been a really great collaborative process, and I think it's going to continue to be that way as we try to gather more information about what's going on. So I wanted to start out by just kind of giving you some background on canine influenza. I know we have a large diversity in our audience tonight, and some people probably don't know that much about influenza, and I know that some of you know lots and lots about influenza. So the influenza that we've all kind of known for not too long, but for a little while now, is the H3N8 influenza, and that's the influenza that Dr. Cinda Crawford has done an enormous amount of work with, that we first were able to really see that in 2004, 2005, and that was a very canine-specific virus that came from an equine virus. That's the influenza virus that many of you may have heard kind of came from greyhound tracks is the first place that we saw that, and I'll show you some more information about that. The other virus that we're going to talk about tonight, and the one that we're seeing most now, is H3N2. And this virus was first seen around 2006, 2007, first seen in Korea, China, and Thailand, so we often kind of call this the Asian strain. We think there was a transfer of this from avian influenza. This one has had at least one paper written that showed a longer shedding period with the H3N2 in immune-compromised animals. Those were research animals that were given medication that caused them to be immune suppressed, and in those animals compared to animals who weren't immune compromised, those animals shed a little bit longer. So the immune compromised animals shed for 13 days compared to 7 days. And we're going to come back around and talk a little bit more about shedding, but I want to kind of set you up to understand that that's something that we have seen in some of the literature surrounding that virus. With the H3N2, we also have some reports from Korea of infection, clinical signs, and even pretty significant mortality in cats with the H3N2. And so, again, this is all background for what we need to know about those viruses. This is a map, courtesy of IDEXX, of the sort of the point places where they have detected canine influenza virus, the H3N8. And so you can see there's lots of different foci here for where this virus has been seen between 2007 and 2015. This is, again, much of this information comes from IDEXX. Some of it comes also from some of the work that we've seen, but much of the work that's been done with this H3N8, as I said, has come from Cinda Crawford at University of Florida. I think she's with us tonight. The data points that you see on the map were generated with real-time PCR. It comes from IDEXX and was part of their respiratory panel that included 11 infectious agents and many quality controls. Their yearly CIV frequency that they were seeing was about 1 to 4%, and the frequency has declined over the last 4 years. So that's good to know. There was one cluster of the H3N8 in Chicago, and that seemed to kind of flare up, and then it really died out. IDEXX is reporting that they saw some single positives in the past 6 years, but we've actually done a fair amount of surveillance in the shelter in Chicago, and each time we've done it, we've not seen influenza in any of the shelters since that one sort of flare-up. For both of those strains of the canine influenza, we've not seen any evidence of zoonosis so far. So neither of those two current strains have been shown to affect humans. We, of course, hope that won't develop. So that's your background. And then, the real question is what's going on now? That's why we're all here, right? So we're having an outbreak of respiratory disease in Chicago. The first cases were identified in dogs that were actually living in homes. So I'm saying that those are pets, not animals living in shelters. And the risk factors seem to be things like going to training classes, visiting veterinary clinics, going to doggy daycare, being in boarding facilities, and living in elevator apartment buildings. And so in an interesting kind of way, this initially sort of looked like it was a disease of kind of affluent dogs, dogs that get to do all sorts of exciting things. And that was where we initially started to really see the spread. One of the issues that happened very early on in this outbreak is people were sending respiratory disease panels out, but since those respiratory panels that IDEXX was running were looking for the H3N8, that initially there were many animals who were identified as being negative because they were in fact negative for the N8, but they were positive for the N2. So what we realized is that it was in fact an H3N2 outbreak, not an H3N8 outbreak, and we realized that by using PCRs that had a broader range of what they could pick up. And so that was Cornell and Wisconsin doing work together that were able to identify that this was H3N2 and that it was very similar to, or identical almost, potentially to this virus of Korean origin. This is a quote just from the AVMA website, and I think we're still trying to figure all of this out. They're saying, although rumors have circulated that the virus was introduced to the U.S. through dogs rescued and imported from Asia, there is no evidence yet, if there will be ever, to confirm those rumors. So we really don't know how this virus came in or came in to Chicago. We don't know that yet, if we ever will. Lynn, I'm seeing a blank slide now.
Let me see if I can help here, Sandra. Could you refresh your browser, please? I advanced it to the next slide. Yep. There you go. Okay.
I'm going to have you advance because now I'm getting an error message.
Okay.
So hold on just one sec.
So we'd like to ask the audience to get your questions in for Dr. Newberry as soon as you can. And there'll be a poll coming up or you can answer on your screen, but we want to encourage everybody to get their question in. And
okay,
Dr. Newberry's ready. A little technical glitch here, but here we go. We're on slide H3N2 in Chicago.
Great. So this is then, now we recognize this is H3N2 in Chicago. This is a novel virus in the United States. So this virus has never been there. What does that mean to be a novel virus? What that really means is that there are no dogs who would be expected to have immunity to that virus. So if a dog is introduced or meets that virus, they're very, very likely to become infected. And if they're infected, they're very likely to show clinical signs. So it may be that there's about 20% of the dogs who don't show clinical signs, but there would be very few dogs that would be expected not to become infected because we have no sort of herd immunity within any community within the United States. So initially, this novel virus spread, as I said, within those identified risk categories and within dogs who were living in private homes. Some shelters were affected much earlier than others, and we'll kind of come back to what the risk factors were for that. And I would describe it really as a wave-like introduction within shelters. And so what we saw was really, on a Wednesday, the shelter would notice that they had one or two dogs with an unusual kind of honking cough. And by Thursday, they were reporting about 10 or 15 sick dogs. By Friday, up to 50 sick dogs. And by Saturday, up to 70 dogs. And so that's actually a true story of the way the wave moved through one of the shelters. And so that was really the way that we're seeing it, and that's the way that we've seen it in each shelter as the infection has kind of been introduced. What we see is that honking cough, and I've got some video I'm going to show you in a little bit for what that looks like. And each of the shelters, which is very interesting to me, was really able to identify based on clinical signs that all of a sudden something unusual was happening. And so I would talk to them and I'd say, is anything unusual happening? No. How about now? How about now? And as soon as in each shelter, because we were doing the surveillance, each shelter was really able to identify almost right when it came in because they were seeing this whole different kind of picture. So many of them were able to recognize at least the early beginnings of the wave, if not the very, very beginnings of that wave. Thank goodness, mostly what we're seeing is a mild to moderate respiratory disease. We do see some dogs progressing to pneumonia, and we've definitely seen some dogs progress to a very, very severe pneumonia. That I am aware of in the city of Chicago, only a handful of dogs have died from clinical signs, and I'm not actually aware of any dog who's died in a shelter because of those clinical signs. And so that's really great news. And one of the ways that I've been thinking about this and wanted to sort of share this insight, some of you may have even been working in shelters during the 70s or working in veterinary clinics. But, in the 1970s, parvovirus, canine parvovirus, was a novel virus. And my understanding is that it followed a very similar sort of wave as it came in. And walking through some of the shelters in Chicago, it's kind of thanking our lucky stars that this is a disease that mostly causes mild to moderate disease and is not as deadly a virus as something like parvo. So that's the really good news in all of this. And the other really great news is that at this point, no cats have been affected clinically in any shelters that I'm aware of. So we have been monitoring very closely. We've not seen anything at all unusual in cats, even cats that have been in close proximity to infected dogs, sharing the same shelter. We've not seen any positive PCR tests in any cats. And so at least for now, we feel like the cats are doing quite well through this outbreak, and we're really hoping that continues, because if we had to add that on top of everything else that the shelters are struggling with, that would just be really horrible. So we're really happy to say that for whatever reason, even though they saw something very different in Korea, we are not seeing any cats who are clinically affected. The other thing, and I'm going to come back again and talk about this very, very specifically, but we are seeing a longer shedding period for the H3N2 than we were expecting based on what we've seen with the H3N8. With the H3N8, we can usually, as Dr. Crawford likes to say, use the 7 and 7 rule, so about 7 days until they would see clinical signs, and about 7 days until we can feel that the dog is safe to be around other dogs. And what we're finding with the H3N2 is that time frame for us to feel safe around other dogs is much longer, and I'm going to come back around and talk about that. As I said, this has been very collaborative in terms of everybody sharing their information and their research, and that's fantastic. It's been really helpful because we're able to get information out to veterinarians in private practice and veterinarians in shelters, and also just shelter managers and technicians. We're able to get all of that information out as quickly as we possibly can, and so I'm so appreciative of that. One of the things that happened is that IDEXX decided to go back actually and retest all the samples that they had gotten since March, since the middle of March. And so here's another map, courtesy of IDEXX, that's now showing, you can see there's a significant difference here looking at the H3N2 map compared to that H3N8 map. And I've added a couple of spots on here that weren't on IDEXX's map that we know. There was one case that we saw and that was reported out in Sioux City, Iowa, and then there was another individual case that we saw in Dane County, where I live in Madison, Wisconsin, just outside of Madison. There was a case, and that was actually a dog who had traveled to Chicago and then come back up to Wisconsin, and thank goodness again that seems to not have spread any further than that one individual dog. So the data that we've got, looking at this H3N2 data, we've got the IDEXX submissions from March 2015. Those were all retested with the H3N2 real-time PCR in a retrospective study, and what they looked at was a total of 884 swabs, and 63 of those, or 7%, were tested positive for H3N2. And so you can see down here, these were cases from the following geographic areas, which is kind of interesting because we weren't having any real reports of problems in California. They had one positive in California, one in Wisconsin, one in Michigan, one in Indiana, and then the rest were all in that Chicago area. The earliest case in that retrospective study that they were able to detect was March 12th in the Chicago area. So that's probably right around when things were getting rolling for this initial outbreak. Merck and Cornell have collected over 200 positive samples from the Chicago area, and all the samples that they have typed have been H3N2. UW Shelter Medicine Program and the Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Lab have collected almost 300 samples, and every day we're collecting more actually from shelters, starting at the beginning of April, and we've had over 175 positives, and we've typed over 60 of those, and all that have been typed have been H3N2. I'm mentioning the typing because there's also been lots of sort of questions and concern about, are both viruses circulating in Chicago? And so all the evidence that we have at this point, and again, this is all very new information that we're sharing, all the evidence so far is that the only virus, the influenza virus that we see circulating is this H3N2. Again, none of the exposed cats who have been sampled, we sampled a number of sick cats at a couple different shelters, and none of those cats who have been sampled have had positives on PCR. So what's the big deal? That's really the question, right? We have this, we have a virus that causes mild to moderate disease. Dogs in general are not dying from it. And I was on the radio the other day and somebody asked me this question, well, so why is this such a big deal? It has a very, very powerful impact on shelters, that as I've described, this wave coming through the shelter, and shelters are trying very, very hard to be responsible about not releasing the virus. And I think the map that we just looked at should be a really strong indication of how responsible shelters are being, because it would be very, very easy with all of the infected dogs that we have in shelters. There have at times been over 500 dogs in Chicago shelters affected all at the same time. And so it would be very, very easy for that virus to have spread into all of the surrounding states quite significantly through transport. But the shelters are all working very, very hard, and the rescue groups are working very hard to both save lives that need saving and keep animals moving through the shelters at the same time as not spreading this novel virus all over the place. It obviously has a huge impact on shelters, because even though shelters are doing all the things that we would suggest they do in order to prevent this happening or prevent the introduction, even with good isolation, even with gowns and gloves and removing sick animals from the general population, what they're finding is that even if they're doing all the things we would normally ask them to do, it still is spreading quite significantly through the shelters. It's very difficult to manage in a population because it's the biggest effect it's had is really slowing down animals moving through the shelter. So one of the shelters I'm going to talk about tonight has a daily and average intake anywhere between 10 and 20 dogs a day. And so you can't obviously just keep adding 10 and 20 dogs to the population without having some kind of impact on that shelter. Just the scale alone of the treatment needs that's happening in the shelters, it's hard to even imagine needing to provide supportive care to 200 dogs. And there's definitely, at least Chicago Animal Care and Control has experienced about 200 dogs all being sick at the same time, somewhere near there. And so the scale of the need to provide treatment has just been sort of staggering. And then the other big question is, how do we bring this to an end now that it's in a shelter and we have this constant number of animals coming into the shelter? How do we bring that to an end? And so I'm going to, towards the end of the presentation, talk about some different management strategies that so far seem to be working fairly successfully to try to resolve this in the shelters. I don't think any shelter is yet out of the woods, and I don't think the community as a whole is out of the woods, but we're getting there. So here's just a list of the shelters, and I wanted to include the shelters that are working as partners, and I put on here others in rescue groups. I'm not intentionally trying to leave anybody out. If there is anybody that I left out, I apologize. But these are the shelters that I've been aware of and been unbelievably impressed at their ability to respond to this while still managing to maximize their life-saving potential. And that's been pretty astonishing. And the way that they've all been working together and sharing the information that they have and offering whatever they can do to help each other has been really inspiring to me to see. When we think about this from a population standpoint, what are the adverse effects? Well, obviously, animal health and well-being is an enormous negative effect. Slowed and stopped live release, as I discussed, can be an incredible adverse effect. There were 2 shelters that made a choice to just close, and they were able to do that based on their level of intake and the number of open housing units that they had. But others were not able to do that. Again, huge treatment expenses, much less sort of staff time and staff strain. I think one of the things I've seen when I go down to Chicago is just the strain that this is putting on the staff, just sort of the heartache, to be honest, of seeing so many dogs sick at one time can be pretty overwhelming. Many of them have had to cancel fundraisers, and 2 of them actually I know of at least had to cancel their largest fundraising events of the year because they involved bringing lots of dogs together in a central location. And Anti-Cruelty Society in particular had to cancel their bark in the park, and were incredibly creative. And if you're interested, you can look online and see that they actually created an iBark, which is an online. They're sort of doing the online version of their fundraising campaign, so hopefully they'll be successful doing that. Many of them canceled community outreach like vaccine clinics and other things in an effort to not be contributing to the spread of the disease. Many had transfers coming in from source shelters that are, pressured in terms of their live release as well. And thank goodness PetSmart Charities was able to reroute all of those transports rather than sending them in. Staff stress, worry, and then the other big one is exposure of staff animals early on, really making sure that the staff was educated and understood that they could be taking this virus home to their own dogs and that their own dogs also were naive to this virus and likely had no immunity as well. As I said, I'm just amazed by it. There was incredible collaborative planning. There was one shelter, in fact, it was Anti-Cruelty, who said, if we pick up a stray, we'll just keep it instead of bringing it to the animal control facility to try to help relieve pressure on the animal control facility. Everyone's been in conversation. So far, all the shelters involved are reporting that they've been able to manage the outbreak without an increase in euthanasia, which I think is really kind of astonishing. Chicago Animal Care and Control is maintaining a 35% reduction in canine euthanasia compared to the same time period in 2014, sorry. So compared to the same time period last year. And that's something that I think they deserve incredible kudos for just because they have so many animals in the shelter. Their shelter's so big. So to be able to maintain that even in the face of this outbreak, and we're all really hoping that will continue. Also, just amazing has been the support of the transfer and rescue groups who are finding all sorts of creative ways of housing animals that they're removing from the shelter, housing those animals locally while they finish out the course of their disease and stop shedding the virus so that they can then move on to wherever their final destination is. And so there's lots of foster homes and things like that that have stepped up to that challenge, and that's really great. The risk factors that we are seeing in the shelters, and, at this point, this was really early on where we could see the risk factors because some of the shelters were affected earlier than the others. And so, as I said, there were things like very similar to what we were seeing in the privately owned dogs, where if they were sharing a space with a veterinary clinic, so there was one shelter who was sharing a space sort of a lobby area with a veterinary clinic, and of course the sick dogs from the public were going into the veterinary clinic, and the space that was shared was an off-site adoption center. And so the first dogs in that shelter that became sick were the dogs that were at the off-site adoption center, where sick dogs from the public were coming in to see that veterinary clinic. When the dogs in the off-site adoption center became ill, this was before we knew really what was going on, the shelter, again, trying to be responsible, removed the sick dogs from the off-site adoption center, brought them back to the shelter, and then that's how the virus was then introduced to the rest of the shelter. Another shelter had a training center that was shared with the public, so they had dogs on their adoption center who were getting to go to training classes with dogs from the public, which is a great experience for the dogs on the adoption center. But again, that's most likely how the disease was introduced into that shelter. Later on in the course of this, really, I think it was enough just to be bringing in dogs was a risk factor for the shelters, and one by one, each shelter has become infected over time, and has become affected, I should say, over time. How do the shelters identify it? As I said, I think they're doing a great job identifying some kind of unusual presentation in individual dogs. That's usually how it starts, and then they're noticing really that there's this unusual presentation in the population where even if it's a shelter that may have had a sort of higher incidence of respiratory disease, this becomes kind of an unprecedented incidence and prevalence of respiratory disease in the population, where they see this kind of, I've been calling it a wave, really it looks like a tidal wave, where the case numbers just grow incredibly rapidly over a 2 to 4 day period. And we've been using RT-PCR to confirm that when that's happening. This is just sort of an example of, we were doing monitoring and surveillance in one shelter, and we were seeing negatives and negatives. These were all, very, very early on, just looking at dogs who had very newly acquired respiratory disease, and we were seeing negatives and negatives. And then this is our girl that I showed you the picture of here, where we sampled 10 newly sick dogs and had this 1 week positive. This was just a few days later, they were saying to me, wow, we think maybe that might be some kind of contamination, because nothing is really sticking out in terms of respiratory disease. And this is, my way of sort of owning up to that. I really wasn't sure what was going on either. And so here's where I'm saying it's the only week positive we've had, because of the other shelters we were looking at, all we were getting back were these very, very strong positives. And this was a dog who was very newly sick, so we were confused why in a newly sick dog we wouldn't see a strong positive, because with the H3N8, we expect to see shedding very early in the course of disease and then no shedding later on. And so I was warning them, yes, the CIV could have been weekly introduced, but we're really not sure what's going on. Let's rerun it to check. We reran it to check, and 2 days later we went down to the shelter, and we met this little girl, or I guess a few days, 5 days later, and here's what we got. Of the 21 dogs that we tested, every single dog in the shelter that we tested was positive. So all of the newly sick dogs that we tested were positive in this case in just a few days. And on the 23rd, we got an email from the shelter veterinarian saying, before he actually even knew that these results were positive, saying that now he was seeing an unusual cough in the dogs in the shelter. And so we think it's very likely that this little girl is our index case, and she's feeling very sorry about that. She wishes that she hadn't done that. I wanted to just share this with you. I'm kind of mixing a couple of our shelter cases together, but I wanted to share this email with you to really give you a sense of how the shelters are experiencing this. This is from Megan at South Suburban. She says, hello, we've been hit hard here the last couple of days. It broke on Wednesday, with only approximately 5 dogs needing to be isolated and treated. By Thursday morning at 8, I had to quarantine an entire ward, approximately 30 dogs. All are exhibiting signs, including the dry honking cough. All dogs are stable, but it has spread to the remainder of our canine population, totaling about 55 dogs. And so you can see, again, this is not South Suburban because I just wanted to be able to show you this is the pattern that we saw at animal control where we were getting negatives. Then we got 21 positives, and then the next time we went, we had 54 dogs who were all positive just 4 days later. So this is really kind of a tidal wave effect. And on the 23rd, we were sampling really all the sick dogs, just so you know. So we had, this number of sick dogs, and then here just incredibly fast sort of rising tide of disease. So now I want to show the
Dr.
video.
Newberry, can we jump to the poll question first, and then we'll go to your videos?
And while you're doing that, I'm going to try to refresh.
Okay. We have a poll question for the audience. I want to remind you to get your questions in for Dr. Newberry. We're about halfway through the presentation, and I'm sure it's going to go quickly, and then we'll get to your questions. But this is your chance to answer a question for us. Does your organization conduct formal daily health rounds to look for emerging medical problems in the animal population? And you answer on your screen, not in the Q&A window. Answer on your screen, please. Yes, we do formal daily health rounds. Yes, we are a foster network and ask our foster caregivers to report on any health changes. We have our kennel attendants or volunteers report any health issues. No, we don't do formal daily rounds. Don't know, not applicable. Please choose your answer. And we'll go to the results. Can you see the results, Dr. Newberry?
I can, and that looks great. So we've got a good number of you who are doing formal daily health rounds, and at least a good number of you who aren't doing formal rounds are having your kennel attendants or volunteers report health issues. There's some of you, it looks like, who are foster rescue groups, and you're also having people report any health changes to you. So that's really great. And for the little tiny sliver of you who are not doing daily rounds, I hope you guys will consider it, because one of the things that is, I think, very helpful is getting in early and sort of knowing what's going on and, being able to pick that up.
So I've taken you to your first video clip.
Okay, let me push this. Great. So what I want to do now is these are very short little clips, but what I'm hoping to do is just kind of give you a sense of what this looks like. These are actually all from Chicago Animal Care and Control because I was there most recently. And just give you a sense, this little girl has really, she again is kind of a little bit of a poster child for the honking cough that we see. And then Lynn, I'm frozen again.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'll advance for you, Dr. Newberry. Here we go with the second clip. Go ahead.
And so I think I'm going to try one more time. Okay, now I'm able to see him too. So here's just another coughing boy for you.
So we're on the third clip now.
Okay.
And I'll advance to the last clip for you.
Yeah, and before you advance, did you already do it? Oh, yeah, there we go. And this guy is, he's hardly coughing, but I wanted to show you him as well because this was another pretty typical presentation to see these guys just sort of standing and having some difficulty breathing and just kind of hang head. I really don't feel good. The dogs are febrile. And so even before they may start coughing, you may see clinical signs that look like this, where the dog just really very clearly is not feeling well. And so I wanted to just show you him as well. And so he's not got that really, really super obvious respiratory disease, but as you look at him, his stance and the way he's holding his head should be indicating not only is he not feeling well, but he's also having some difficulty breathing. So the challenges in terms of doing this has been very challenging for the shelters. It's been challenging for us as consultants to try to give the shelters the advice that they need, because all the information has been kind of still under development. The information is changing as we collect it on a sort of constant basis. Many of the shelters are finding it challenging to get on-site veterinary care. So some of them have veterinarians on staff, others don't. Many of the private vets don't want sick dogs from the shelter going to their clinic, so they're really needing to provide all the veterinary care they can within the shelter. And there's a couple of great vets in the city who I know have been visiting these shelters on site rather than bringing the dogs to their own clinics, and I'm sure that's in huge part why so many of the dogs are doing well and recovering. The treatment, diagnostic costs, maintaining quality of care, and then intake pressure, as I mentioned, is another really huge challenge for them. One of the other things that's been very interesting but also confusing is this sort of confounding factors in terms of really figuring out what's going on with the flu, is that we have other ongoing respiratory disease in the shelter, and so the clinical signs for those illnesses may overlap. And what you see down here is I'm showing you, here's a dog who started with clinical signs on April 10th. And we tested the dog. The first time we tested the dog was April 21st, and the dog was positive. And so we don't know. This dog has had clinical signs theoretically since April 10th. We don't know, is this dog a dog who's been sick since April 10th, or was it that this dog had some other illness, some other pathogen causing respiratory disease early on, and then became infected with influenza a little later on. The other thing that we've seen is that sometimes we get these negatives in the middle of the positives, but we'll come back and talk a little bit about that. So we're seeing, here we've had this dog. This could be that this dog was sick since April 10th, and now we have a negative on April 25th. But it turns out, if we keep testing, that actually the dog was still shedding virus, even though it was just a week positive. So it's difficult for us to say exactly, when did this dog develop clinical signs. But one thing that's been very helpful is to look. This is the dog's litter mate. And here we can see that this dog actually didn't develop clinical signs until April 20th, and then had the positive on the 22nd. And also had a negative, and then jumped back to being positive, and then another negative. So all of this it's kind of muddying the time frame for the influenza as we're trying to look at this in the field, and we're trying to figure out what kind of advice we want to give to shelters. So we put in a fair amount of work to try to clarify that. And some of the work that we've done is really to look at viral shedding. And the first question that we wanted to answer is, does this virus shed with a similar pattern to the H3N8 virus? Because we wanted to know, are we safe to tell shelters that after 7 days the dogs are probably no longer infectious? And so the first thing we did was set out to look at that, and the first answer that we got was no. It was not okay to tell them to release dogs after 7 days, because we see here that we have positives on the 18th, and then many of those dogs, the majority of those dogs, were still positive on April 30th. What we don't know at this point is whether these positives, these are PCR positives, Whether those PCR positives are still viable and infectious virus, that's something that we don't have the answer to. We're working on trying to get that answer, and we hope we will. So we know that the viral load counts have tended to drop over the course of disease, and so that's good news that we're seeing that dropping. But this was very concerning, and this actually also fell right in line with what we were seeing, because we had originally said, well, we think this will behave like the other virus, so why don't you, after 7 days, feel free to go ahead and put those animals up for adoption. But what we were seeing is that the shelters that were putting those animals up for adoption after, 7 days, when they were bringing new dogs into the adoption center, now they were having newly sick dogs in the adoption center, and it looked like those animals were becoming exposed within the adoption center. Turns out that that's probably really what was happening when we see this pattern of shedding. Once we saw this, we said, whoa, we need to look at this a little more closely. And so we started trying to follow these dogs out even a little bit further. And so this is the same set of dogs. Now I've just kind of grouped them together a little bit differently. And hopefully what you can appreciate is this first thing that I have labeled is day 1, is when they first saw clinical signs beginning in the shelter. This second day 1 that I've got labeled here is actually the day that we first did our PCR testing. And hopefully what you're noticing is that on day 18, we still have dogs who are still shedding virus. And so this also jibed with what we were seeing, because once we heard that that we still had dogs being infected in the adoption center when dogs were moving up after 7 days, we said, well, okay, let's make it 14 days, because we thought, well, okay, we're seeing this shedding for a little bit longer. Let's make it 14 days. And what 2 of the shelters were reporting is that when they were using 14 days as a cutoff, they were still seeing what looked like dogs becoming infected from what were dogs that they thought would not be shedding anymore. And now we look at this information and we see, oh my goodness, they are still shedding at day 17 pretty significantly, and we even have some stragglers still shedding at day 18. This is information that we just got just a couple days ago, and we're continuing to test these dogs to see when they will all go negative. We're hoping it's, day 19. But the recommendation that we're making now to shelters, because we're not aware of, how long this might go, is that we've changed the recommendation now, because we're seeing this shedding and because we're seeing this anecdotal information that dogs were still becoming infected when they were moving dogs up after 14 days, that we've gone to a 21-day recommendation for keeping infected dogs separated from other dogs, or before moving those dogs to another place where we haven't seen this novel virus. This is a huge issue for shelters, because, and especially for those of you who know me and my usual recommendations to shelters, it pains me to have to tell shelters that they should keep dogs back from moving through the population for such a long period of time, and creates an even greater strain on the shelter, population management. And so, again, what we're hoping is the rescue groups will continue to take these animals, but we really want to be responsible, and we don't want to be sending shedding animals out into the community. We are continuing to test. We have several cohorts of dogs that we're following forward, but obviously it takes time to watch them stop shedding over time. So we're very interested to see where this will go. As you can see, the majority of them were still shedding at day 13. Many were still shedding at day 16, lots still at day 17. The other thing that we're noting here is that some dogs were having negatives and then bouncing back to positives, as I said. And so we're now also making a recommendation, if anybody wants to release the dogs earlier than 21 days, that they should have 2 negative tests before they're certain that the dog is or as certain as they can be until they're more assured. We haven't seen any who had 2 negatives bounce back to positive, but we're trying to follow them out a little bit for that as well.
Dr. Newberry, we have a question from an audience member on this shedding.
Yes.
If the dog is asymptomatic after 14 days, is it appropriate to adopt it out?
I would, what we've done, and we can share this information with any shelters that want to, is we've put together some documents. And Lynn, I think maybe we could put those on the Maddie's website. Is that true? We can share the documents. We've created some documents in releasing animals to owners to give them really clear information so that they know. So I think it would be okay to adopt an animal out, but you would want to be very clear with the owner that they should keep that animal away from other dogs and being aware of things like riding in the elevator or, certainly not going to dog parks, not going to training classes, things like that. And what it's actually Chicago Animal Care and Control that we created these forms for. And they're actually asking people to sign those forms and say that they understand and that they promise that they won't be doing that, so that we can feel responsible. And so what we don't want to do is jam the shelter with dogs who can't move through the shelter, but we do want to be very, very careful about releasing animals into the population. Again, not because the virus is a particularly deadly virus, though it has caused some animals to die, but more because it is a novel virus, and the consequences of it spreading throughout the country would be really dramatic.
Thank you.
Sure. So when we talk about testing, again, as I said, we're using an influenza type A PCR and then typing that. So that's the testing that we're doing in Wisconsin through the WVDL. Initially, Cornell and Wisconsin are the first ones who started this testing. IDEX now also has a validated test for that. We're using just a shallow nasal swab. That's been sufficient to pick up our positives. We've not been using anesthesia or a deep nasal swab in order to do that. The WVDL has really preferred getting their samples in viral transport media or in a little bit of saline in the tube with the swab rather than just sending a dry swab. It's very important to be careful of cross-contamination of the samples, and we've been very, very careful as we're taking our samples, making sure that we're changing gloves in between each sample, and very, very careful to make sure that virus is not moving from one animal to the other so that each animal is getting a positive. We're also trying to screen for other pathogens so that we get a sense of what the other pathogens are that are present in the shelters alongside the kind of co-factors with the canine influenza. So timing for when would you want to do this sampling? Usually for flu, it's best very early in the course of disease, and usually for the other, for H3N8, it can be difficult actually to pick up positives because they often shed a little before clinical signs and then only for a few days after the clinical signs start. But what we're seeing again here is that the positives seem to be lasting for 12 to 13 days duration. The average that I have for the animals where I've been able to do an individual test and then follow them forward, I'm seeing about a 16-day shedding as the average. I'm hoping that may change as I get more animals, more cohorts that I'm following forward. And I'm hoping it's possible that it may be there's something unusual about the one cohort, but it's not really, doesn't really look like what I'm seeing from the animals that I'm following forward. We are getting weak positives both early and late with clinical signs. And then, as I said, we're seeing some that are positive, negative, and then positive again. I talked about this very early on, but prevention is very, very difficult in the face of shelter introduction. We've had shelters who are trying their best to be vigilant. They're monitoring, doing early identification, and some of them have had even very, very thorough isolation at their shelters, but even in those cases it often has not been quite enough, and we're not sure if part of that may have been because we were unclear about that shedding period, and so we were releasing the dogs from isolation maybe sooner than we should have been. And so hopefully things will resolve better now that we're a little bit clearer about what that shedding period is. Again, the best prevention is to be very responsible about animal movement so that at least we're preventing this from moving to a different area and creating further hot spots. And as best we can, having a short length of stay in shelter care, so especially for animals, if there are animals that you can move through the shelter quickly and not expose to the already exposed population, that's ideal. And as those animals are coming through, we want to be able to also, make people aware that even though they're leaving the shelter now, they may come down with clinical signs within the next 7 days. Whatever can be done to prevent introduction is the best possible prevention within the city limits. That's been very difficult, but we definitely want to think about that in terms of sort of transport and movement of animals from one place to the other. We want to be very careful about that. So the recommendations that we're making are clinically healthy or exposed animals that are leaving from an affected facility, that they are okay to release, just as that questioner asked. But what we're recommending is to quarantine or separate those animals from other dogs for at least 7 days. If no clinical signs develop in 7 days, then you're probably good to go. But if the animal becomes affected or the animal is leaving clinically ill from an affected area or organization, again, those are okay to release from the shelter, but they should be isolated. I'm sorry, I updated that one slide and I missed this one, but they should be isolated for at least 21 days and ensure adequate resources for care. And we're actually, again, asking shelters to, really speak to that they can provide the adequate resources for the supportive care that might be necessary for those sick animals. Do not travel to unaffected areas until after that waiting period. And again, that's a 21-day period. Sorry, I missed that as I was updating the presentation. Information is itself prevention, so be very, very clear with people who are removing animals from an affected facility or even an affected community that it is very, very likely that the dog may become sick. Vaccination, we've been getting a lot of questions about vaccination. There are, of course, we hope this is one of the tools in our toolbox most of the time. There are 2 vaccines available. Both of the vaccines for canine influenza that are available are the killed H3N8 virus, not the H3N2 virus that we're seeing in Chicago. It's unclear at this point whether those vaccines would be cross-protective or not. We have a little bit of anecdotal information about just a few dogs that were vaccinated with the H3N8 that seem to have come down with the virus at this point with the H3N2. So Merck and Zoetis both have vaccines available. Merck's Novavax was the first licensed vaccine. It's licensed for 6 weeks and up. Both of these require 2 doses. The Merck vaccine requires 2 doses, 2 to 4 weeks apart, and the Zoetis Vanguard vaccine is 2 doses, 3 weeks apart. Both have been shown to reduce clinical signs and reduce viral shedding for the H3N8 infections. It's unclear if they would be protective, as I said, for the H3N2. The other big thing with these vaccines, they're both killed vaccine products, and the time to onset of these vaccines makes them really less helpful in a shelter setting. And so I wanted to just sort of graphically show you that if we start here at shelter intake, even if we were vaccinating on intake with this killed vaccine product, if we give the first vaccine and then exposure is likely to happen here where this orange arrow is, we're still in that period where we've just given that first vaccine and have 2 to 3 weeks before we can even give the second vaccine that would give the boost in immunity, but we've already exposed the dogs to the virus. So this vaccine would be most recommended for dogs who maybe are going to stay in foster care for a long period of time before being exposed or before coming into the shelter setting, but it's probably not worth the resource investment for most shelters who are moving animals into the shelter and then out again quickly, because most of them would be leaving the shelter before they even got the second vaccine. One of the benefits might be in an area that is on a border area to the affected area, that, if the shelter can get the first vaccine into the dog, that then when the dog goes out into the community, the owner is already a little bit ahead on that timeline and can give the second vaccine, and then the dog would be protected. And so that would be something for each individual shelter to kind of consider whether they wanted to make that resource investment. But as a preventative measure for shelters in the city, it's probably not worth the resource investment for them at this time, again, because we're not even completely sure how effective this vaccine would be against this particular virus. Sorry, I'm frozen again, Lynn. Can you
Here we go.
move that?
Yes, I've gotten it. Environmental management.
Okay, let me just get there, sorry. So environmental management, again, there is not a lot of literature about, how long these viruses live. So we have reports and recommendations out there that are saying things like what you see on this slide, so 48 hours on surfaces, 24 hours on fabric, 12 hours on hands, but it's very difficult to sort of find the source of, where are these recommendations coming from, and they're probably not coming from this virus specifically. They're probably coming from, extrapolating from what we know about other viruses, and the truth is that these viruses probably last a little bit less time. They're probably not very viable for long periods of time, and so that's really good news. These are good rules to follow in terms of being, very careful about things. And most common shelter disinfectants will kill the flu viruses on surfaces. So again, thank goodness this is not like parvo. This is easier to get rid of and much shorter lived than some of those unenveloped viruses that we encounter in shelters. How are we going to stop this cycle? We have, new dogs coming in. I think of this as kind of adding fuel to our fire on a regular basis. And so what I wanted to do to kind of close up just a little bit is to talk about the different strategies that the shelters are using to try to stop what is kind of this vicious cycle in terms of, can we actually get this virus out of the city and out of the shelters in the city, and I really hope that we can. So some of the shelters have been able to limit significantly or stop intake, and so what they've been able to do is really create this break between new dogs that are coming in, and basically what they're doing is diverting any new intake they have somewhere else. And then they end up with this population where they have, sick dogs that are exposed, and then now they're starting to have some dogs who have recovered. Over time, the first thing that's happening in those shelters is that the number of sick dogs is growing. So this is the next slide, Lynn. And what we see is a very large population. So this is where the tidal wave has hit, and we have a very large population of sick dogs, a smaller population of exposed dogs because most of the exposed dogs become sick, and we have a small population of recovered dogs. What we had hoped is that this would turn over quite quickly, and that we hoped that all those sick dogs would turn into recovered dogs within a week. And what we're thinking now is, that would have been a lovely scenario, but that's not so much what we're seeing. It is happening, though, and we have a couple of shelters where now we've got mostly recovered dogs a few sick dogs and a few exposed dogs. And so at that point, the shelter should be able to open their doors to have those recovered dogs now intermingle with the new intake dogs. One shelter that's just getting ready to open, we were just joking that they should advertise because they've got the only dogs in the city of Chicago up for adoption that are very, very likely not to get influenza. They're kind of got the influenza-proof dogs that they can adopt out now, so I think they can run some kind of a special on influenza-proof dogs. The other alternative is to establish a clean break, and this has been a strategy that one shelter is using, and they're doing it pretty effectively. So Paws Chicago has been pretty effectively able to do this clean break where they've got new intake dogs that are coming through and going on a completely different pathway than other dogs, but what they're able to do now is have these recovered dogs, again, mix with the new intake dogs. One of the problems was that before we had the shedding period right, we were doing this mixture, and then these new intake dogs were also becoming sick and then coming back into the sick dog population. We're hoping with the new information that we have that that's not likely to happen again. The other option, and this is kind of our least favorite, but we're hoping it will work, and it seems to just be coming into a viable solution, is for the shelters that are unable to establish a clean break because of the structure of their facility or because of the number of dogs affected within the facility. What we're hoping is that we're able to utilize this developing immunity. So as the sick dogs become recovered dogs, we're hoping that we can then mix those dogs with the new intake dogs and that we'll have a larger and larger growing population of recovered dogs. And over time, these exposed dogs and the sick dogs will shrink and hopefully disappear from the population, being replaced by these recovered dogs. Obviously, it's very, very important as we're using this kind of strategy to be sure that we're getting the recovery period correct and that we've got that shedding period correct, because if we're putting what we think are recovered dogs but those dogs are still shedding, this population management strategy would fail. And so that's what we're looking at now. Thanks to Maddie's Fund, we're able to really follow the dogs forward, and what we're waiting for is when we start seeing negatives in these recovered dogs, that's when we'll know that we can then start trying to combine the new intake dogs with these recovered dogs, and then we hope over time that we'll have the other population of the sick dogs and the exposed dogs shrinking. So that's the strategy that we're having to use in some of the larger shelters. The last thing I want to touch on is treatment, and the reason I'm touching on this only very quickly is what I really want the shelters to do is work with a veterinarian who's local and on-site, or can at least come on-site to give them information about how to provide supportive care. This is a viral disease, so mostly what we need to be doing is providing supportive care in the forms of nutritional support and hydration. I was talking to one woman, Linda, at the Animal Welfare League in Chicago Ridge, and she has been doing this incredible work where they have somebody who's making chicken for all the dogs and bringing in chicken, and they were able to get all the dogs eating and rehydrated by giving sub-Q fluids and chicken soup and all of those things. So they're really going to extraordinary lengths. Want shelters using broad-spectrum antibiotic treatment, again, not because it's a bacterial infection, but because we need to prevent or treat those secondary infections. Monitor closely for progression to pneumonia and work with a veterinarian to develop a specific treatment protocol for the animals that you're seeing. We also really want you to work with a veterinarian to develop very specific treatment plans for any individual animals that develop care needs or who are not responding to treatment. So those are things that we really want to encourage shelters to do that, and if veterinarians need advice about that or shelter veterinarians need advice about that, we are available to help, give advice and talk about what other shelters have done and are successfully seeing, because I would say that all of the shelters in the city right now are very successfully treating and managing the cases that they're seeing in the shelter. They've seen many cases of pneumonia, and all of those cases of pneumonia have been resolving over time, and all of the dogs are recovering. So that is the end of the slides that I have, and I'm happy to answer any questions that have come along as we've talked.
Okay, great. Well, let's take the first question. Is the 18-day shedding period a post-recovery shedding period, or is it counting from the first positive test?
The 18 days that I'm talking about was from the first positive test, and what I was trying to show in the slide, and I can try to go back to that slide. What I was trying to show in that slide is that it was 18 days between positive tests. So from day one here, the second day one that's listed here, to the last shedding was 18 days, but we know that illness actually began in that shelter 3 days sooner than the first positive test. So we don't know when, in fact, these dogs first became positive or first started shedding. But from the first positive test that we had until the last test that we did prior to this presentation, which truly I just got those results on just 2 nights ago, those dogs were still shedding. And so we hope that they will not be shedding anymore at 19 days or at 20 days, and that's why I'm using that 21-day isolation. I'm saying from the first time you're seeing clinical signs, 21 days from there.
Great. So here's the next question, Dr. Newberry. How long from intake to the shelter to developing clinical signs of exposed at the shelter?
And that has varied very widely for the shelters. The shelters have had a wave of their own, where some shelters were affected very early, as I said, and some shelters, there was one shelter who has remained unaffected throughout this outbreak until just yesterday. Was the first time that they felt they really had clinical signs, and we had been doing surveillance, and all the dogs we had tested were negative. So in a shelter that's having ongoing current clinical disease, we're seeing clinical signs developing within 7 days, and some even sooner.
Thank you. Here's our next question.
Yeah.
Ready? As a shelter vet, how would I handle isolating and treating this disease versus a typical outbreak of kennel cough, which we see here on occasion? The clinical signs and presentation look the same, so what should I do differently?
It's a really great question, and yes, it looks very similar. Though what I'm understanding from the shelters is that as they start to see cases, they're noticing that it looks a little bit unusual. It's looking a little bit more severe. The dogs seem to feel a little worse than what they're used to with their sort of run-of-the-mill respiratory disease. I think that if you're in an area where you think there may be flu, I would have a very heightened awareness. I'd have a heightened monitoring and try to remove sick animals from the general population and get them into isolation as soon as you possibly can. And then to really impress upon people that when dogs are in isolation, that you want to do everything you possibly can to control spread, through fomite spread and aerosol spread. What I've seen is it has been very, very difficult. Many of the shelters that are trying their best, I don't want to be fatalistic about it, because I have seen over time, knock wood, the one that I know the best right now is Paws Chicago, is doing a very good job of moving some animals through a different part of the shelter than where their sick dogs are, and they feel like they're reasonably successfully moving dogs up for adoption and having them not get sick. And so really creating that strong separation between animals who are sick and animals who are not sick. Not every shelter can do that. Not every shelter has a facility that provides them the capacity to be able to do that. Paw Chicago has 2 floors in their building, and all the sick animals now are upstairs, and they're moving the other animals through the downstairs. And they're moving them through very quickly in a day or 2 and then up for adoption. Hopefully
as a follow-up to that question, Dr. Newberry, since the clinical signs are so similar, how do you decide who to test for canine influenza virus?
What we had been doing, the sort of matrix we were using for figuring out who to test is we were testing animals who we were doing a kind of general surveillance on animals who were newly sick. So again, if you're in an area where you think there might be influenza, or you're in an area near where there might be influenza, or animals are coming in from areas where there was influenza, then my recommendation would be to do some kind of periodic surveillance on dogs who are newly becoming sick, just kind of looking for it.
Okay, will asymptomatic H3N2 carrier dogs test positive on a PCR?
I have not picked up any asymptomatic dogs at this point. That doesn't mean that they are not shedding. And again, if we look at normal behavior for flu viruses, we expect that it's very likely that they will shed for a couple of days before they show clinical signs, at least. And so I expect that would be true in this case as well. It's not something that we had focused on, so I don't have an exact answer, but I expect that there probably are some asymptomatic dogs. And so even in the shelters that were reporting that they didn't have any unusual respiratory disease, we were still doing some of our surveillance looking at those dogs who weren't sick, but we were getting negatives on all of those.
Here's a good question. Are shelters releasing dogs to rescues if they see cases in their shelters? I'm concerned that the illness is getting imported into a new state with transport. What should transports do if they think they see a case?
So what the shelters in Chicago, to my understanding, all of the shelters are doing this. I'm absolutely sure that Animal Care and Control is doing it because I worked with them to develop their plan. They were really committed to sort of responsibly trying to maintain some live release from their shelter so that they didn't have to increase euthanasia just because there wasn't enough room in their shelter. And what they're doing is giving rescue groups very, very specific guidelines. So what we're telling them is if a dog leaves the shelter with no clinical signs, they should be holding the dog for 7 days. If clinical signs develop, they should be holding the dog for 21 days past the time that clinical signs develop. And if they're taking the dog who already has clinical signs, they should be holding the dog for 21 days. And so what they're agreeing to is that they will hold the dog for 21 days away from other dogs, and that they have the capacity to provide adequate care for that dog, and that they won't move the dog to any area that doesn't have influenza already, and that they won't cross a state line without a certificate of veterinary inspection.
Very good. Do you have any information on how long protective immunity lasts after a natural infection with H3N8 or H3N2?
They don't have that information, and it may be available for H3N8, but I don't know it. But I think that's something that I'm sure will be looked into as we start to look at the results of this outbreak and once vaccines begin to be developed.
Does the IDEX panel now include H3N2 as well as H3N8?
It does, and they wanted to be very specific that people know that, in fact, it has a specific validated test for the H3N2. If there's shelters that are interested in testing, the Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Lab and the Shelter Medicine Program at UW are sort of partnering to offer some special shelter pricing for any shelters that are concerned about canine influenza, and so they would just contact our Shelter Medicine Program if they felt like they wanted to do that testing, but IDEXX is offering that testing as well.
Okay, great. Would you test
and I just
any
changed
dogs
the slide so that you can, I'm sorry, I just changed the slide so you can see the contact information if you want to contact our program about doing any further testing through the WVDL.
Okay, I'll put that back up, Dr. Newberry.
And veterinarians, private veterinarians can also contact the WVDL independently, but this is a program that we've got going just for shelters.
Excellent. I'll leave that up for a few minutes. Here's another question. Would you test any dogs showing respiratory signs, even in a state where there's been no case of the flu? How long does it take Cornell to test, and what is the cost?
I don't have the information for how long it takes Cornell to test or what it costs. I can say that for a shelter at the WVDL, we're giving same-day results. So if we get the results that morning, you will have the results by that afternoon. And the cost to shelters is $33. And the other part of the question, sorry, if I was in an area where there had been no influenza detected, I don't know that I would test every dog with respiratory disease. I think I would only test if I was feeling suspicious. But you certainly wouldn't be wrong to test if you had a concern.
What are the best measures to ensure that we do not contaminate our own homes and dogs with the virus?
I think that's another really great question. I am hoping that anyone who's working in an environment where there are affected dogs is, changing their clothes. One of the things that I do when I'm in the shelters is I have a pair of shoes that I wear just in the shelters, and I'm actually cleaning my shoes I have easily disinfectable shoes, and I clean those with accelerated hydrogen peroxide. Before I go anywhere else. If I'm going to more than one shelter, I would bring more than one pair of shoes with me. I bring several pair of scrubs when I'm going so that I can change scrubs in between each place. This is a picture of my 15-year-old Labrador, and you can guarantee I'm changing clothes before I come home. I put all my clothes in a plastic bag, and I make sure that all of that gets into the wash as soon as I get home, and I take a shower before I pet anybody at my house. And I'm hoping everybody else is doing the same thing.
A published study from South Korea of a shelter said that of the cats infected with H3N2 there, all became sick and 40% died. Is the H3N2 Chicago outbreak a different variant so that the cats don't get sick from it, or is it just that owners don't test cats?
We have done, as I said earlier in the presentation, we've done a little bit of surveillance on cats, not an enormous amount, but a fair amount in a couple of different shelters. And we've even tested one cat that got adopted from Animal Care and Control. And we've not seen any positives in any of the cats. And I've been through several of the shelters myself, and also the shelters themselves are reporting nothing unusual happening in the cats in Chicago. And so I'm hoping that luck holds out. I don't have an explanation for it at this point. It may be that the cats are becoming infected and not showing clinical signs. We're hoping that we'll be able to look at that going forward by seeing if the cats are seroconverting to the virus. But right now, we're just fortunate. I don't know if that means that it may be some kind of variant. We're seeing an incredible amount of similarity. The virus is pretty much identical to that Korean virus. So we're just not sure why it's not affecting the cats. But we're certainly pretty happy that it isn't.
I agree with that. Has anyone looked at the role of co-infection? For example, can a dog infected with both influenza and Bordetella have more severe disease, I've heard it suggested that vaccinating also for Bordetella parainfluenza might be wise.
We always recommend that shelters are using the respiratory vaccines on intake along with the core vaccines. So yes, that's definitely recommended, and I don't know that we don't have all that data yet to show that there are specific pathogens that are co-infecting the dogs, but certainly it would be expected that those co-infections might create more significant problems. We're also very lucky. We've done some surveillance for Strep Zoo epidemicus in Chicago, and we are not seeing it be present at all. It's something that has tended to like to co-infect and show up in shelters that have influenza. But again, I think we're very, very lucky and quite happy about it that we're not seeing Strep Zoo at this point.
How many cases are being reported, or how are cases being reported? This is the first time I've heard of a case in Minnesota. Is there a central database?
I have not heard of any cases in Minnesota, so if you're hearing of a case in Minnesota, that's news to me. It doesn't mean that it isn't so. It may be that I just didn't see it. And so I don't know that there is a central database. We're trying to share information about cases as quickly as we can when we're seeing them. And when I say we, I mean at UW, Cornell, Merck, IDEX. I think all of us are trying to share those cases as they come up.
Are there concerns about spreading via HAVAC systems?
Certainly, the virus is airborne. It's got a good possibility for aerosol transmission. So it's not something that I'm thinking about. Within an apartment building, for example, though it's possible, but within a shelter, certainly we're seeing what looks like aerosol transmission.
Okay. How are normal processes like behavior evaluations and spay-neuter surgery lists being affected in these shelters?
Massively. Many of the shelters feel like they need to shut down to such things. They're all trying to find creative ways to still allow some of that to happen. Certainly, if they have a ward of dogs and every dog in that ward is already affected, then it's probably okay to go ahead and allow for those things. It's very difficult for the shelters to sort of gauge, when they should be still working towards prevention and when they should be sort of throwing up their hands and saying, everyone has already been exposed, and so we're really closing the barn door after the horse is gone. And so different shelters are trying, again, different strategies with that. But everyone is trying the best they can to reduce the risk of transmission, but still get dogs, into safe places.
What are you recommending for states like Michigan with one case when shelters are planning to hold large adoption events?
I think if we're seeing just a single case and we've had a week pass since that single case, that's the case in Wisconsin as well, where we had this one individual case and that dog has recovered and it's been quite a while and we're not seeing other cases, that then cautiously people can move forward. I think we need to be aware, and people need to be aware that if they're taking their dogs to not large adoption events as much as dog parks and things like that there is that risk. But I think when we're only seeing a single case and we're not seeing evidence of spread after 7 days, then I think we can worry less.
Are cough suppressants being used in the shelter cases to help prevent spread? And what antibiotics are being used to treat the secondary bacterial component?
Some of the shelters are trying. Some work with cough suppressants. Again, I'm not involved to a very, very deep level on all of the treatment decisions. I'm leaving that to the local veterinarians. Many of the shelters are not using cough suppressants and are still, being very successful, and the dogs are faring well. The antibiotics, as always in shelters, are the first choice they're going to tends to be doxycycline. Many of them are using combinations to achieve a broad spectrum. Zoetis just very kindly donated some Convenia for the vet students at UW to go down and help, and so we may try the Convenia. I think, what we're really shooting for is some kind of broad spectrum with some sense of, what those secondary pathogens are likely to be. And so things like Mycoplasma, Bordetella, and then some of the other, just secondary invaders that can be causing that pneumonia.
Fearful clients are expressing concerns that their dogs could get infected by coyotes or foxes that have urinated or defecated in the local area. Comment?
I think that's unlikely. That what we mostly see is respiratory secretions coming from being in contact with dogs. I think is that's really what we're looking at. It's an interesting question. There are actually a fair number of coyotes in Chicago, and so I don't know that anybody's tried to look at the coyotes in the Chicago area and see if any of them have been infected or affected by the outbreak.
Okay, well, we'll take one more question here. We've answered a lot of questions in a very short time, and I think we've gotten all the high points. So is there a benefit for shelter employees to vaccinate their own pets?
That's the other question, and I wish I had a hard and fast answer. Again, it will take some time for those vaccines to be effective. You'll need to vaccinate and then revaccinate in order to boost that immunity. And even once you have the immunity that you get is it helps reduce clinical signs and reduce shedding, but it may not prevent infection completely. And again, we don't know whether there'll be cross-reactivity, so we don't know whether the vaccine for the N8, which is what exists now, will be protective for the N2.
Well, thank you, Dr. Newberry. That's the end of our event tonight. We want to thank Dr. Newberry and all of you for your time. We invite you to take a few minutes to complete our survey. Your feedback is important to us. Click on the link on your screen. If for some reason you don't see the link, it's also in the resource file at the bottom of your screen, and the link will be emailed to you in a few days. This webcast will be available on demand shortly, and we hope you will share this presentation on your social sites. We hope you can join us for our last two dermatology series, Stopping the Scales, Greasiness, and Odor of Seborrhea in Shelter and Foster Home Dogs on May 21st, and What to Do About Ear Problems in Shelter and Foster Home Dogs on June 4th. Thanks again for being here with us this evening, and good night.